Hi and welcome to my PAL Workflow Masterclass. Now I dare say most of you are familiar with this workflow that I promote in the ebooks, but I wanted to go into a little bit more detail in this masterclass. So without much further ado, let's get started. PAL is an acronym for Portrait, Action and Landscape, and it's a workflow that ensures that I rarely miss my shot. I can access these groups of camera settings that I've registered to the camera's memories by simply turning the shoot mode dial to 1, 2 or 3, and I put them in order: 1 for portrait, 2 for action and 3 for handheld landscapes. Now, because I'm often shooting a varied range of subjects, it's handy having those groups of known settings. So I might be shooting portraits of people, switching to portraits of animal, doing action of things moving very rapidly, and moving to landscape shooting. Now, as the days unfold, obviously I'm going to keep on changing my subjects, but 99% of the time I still start with 1, 2 or 3 on that shoot mode dial. So they're not settings that I use occasionally, they're settings that I use for more than 95% of the subjects that I shoot. And I'm going to be going into detail how we can use those as starting points, but fine-tune the settings depending on what we're shooting. Now I do have masterclasses in portraiture, in action settings and also in landscape, so you might want to check out those 3 masterclasses about how I approach each of my portrait, action and landscape genres. Now, for people with late model alpha cameras, I do have cam sets which will help you set up the camera simply by putting a file on a memory card and then loading that, and then your camera will be set up exactly the same as my camera in this regard. Now, it is only available for late model Sonys. It first appeared on the Alpha 7R4, then moved on to the Alpha 9 II, A1, Alpha 7 IV. Now, one of the late model cameras that didn't get this feature was the Alpha 7C. And of course, any camera that predates the Alpha 7R4, such as the A7 III or A7R3, don't have this feature. It's also not available on the APS-C cameras when I'm making this video tutorial. If you do have a camera that you can't set up using one of my cam sets, then basically you'll go to the ebook and then look for the genres of portrait, action and landscape, use the tables of settings and then program those memories manually, and that ebook will give you the support to do that manual process. Now, they are the memory recall, so we will access these 3 groups of settings by simply turning the shoot mode dial to 1, 2 or 3, but we have to set them up slightly differently, and this will take some time. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about how we do that if you are doing the manual approach. Now, as I said, the memories are available on all Sony Alpha cameras. Now, some of the cameras only have 2 memories, not 3. So you might have to be a little bit selective about what you're programming to 1 and 2 if you have a camera with only 2 of the 3 memories. But most of the cameras do have those 3 memories that you can recall. Here I'm showcasing one of the APS-C cameras, the Alpha 6400. We turn the shoot mode dial to MR for memory recall, and then we are given the choice to access one of the 3 memories. So let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail. For instance, my portrait settings. This prioritizes shallow depth of field. It freezes any slow movement, so your subjects don't have to be completely static, and it does obviously use IAF in AFC when we're using narrow depth of field, such as we're using f1.8 or 1.4 prime lenses. Now, there are going to be at least least 10 settings wrapped up into my portrait settings. So these are the top 10. There will of course be more, but these are my top 10 settings, which include exposure mode, aperture, ISO, ISO auto minimum shutter speed, drive mode, focus area, face eye priority in AF, tracking sensitivity, and priority in AFC. Now you can see with all of those settings, and these are just 10 of the main settings, it's difficult to access the right group of settings very quickly if we're suddenly shifting from maybe shooting landscapes to portraits. So that is really the benefit of having the main settings registered to a memory. If you were doing that manually, you would have to do at least 2 dial adjustments, 4 custom key adjustments, and 4 menu adjustments to put those in place. So if you are shooting a picture of somebody in the street, perhaps they're going to long be bored of while you set up your camera before you get around to actually starting the portrait shoot. Now obviously I do support most of the late model Sony cameras, right from the Alpha 7 III right through to the latest Sony cameras, and you will find those tables of settings. And of course, it's even if you use a cam set to set up your camera, it is valuable to see how the camera is set up, so you know what settings you're actually using when you're using those 1, 2 and 3 memory recalls. And of course, all of that is available to my patrons on patreon.com. Now, if you're looking at action, you're going to be looking at freezing fast action using very fast shutter speeds. We're going to be looking at tracking that fast action, so it doesn't always have to be in the center of the viewfinder or on the monitor. And we're looking at continuous shooting, basically holding down the shutter release and shooting multiple shots. Now there will be instances where we want to use slower shutter speeds to create movement blur, but I always start with the very fast shutter speeds to freeze fast action, such as this shot of this motorcycle Grand Prix here. This is Marc Marquez, former world champion. Now again, there's going to be at least 10 settings that I will prioritize, and I won't bother going through those again. They're the similar 10 to what we use for portraiture, but obviously using different settings for at least half of those settings there. And landscape handheld, now I do specify handheld because we are going to be leaning on SteadyShot to get our sharp images rather than using tripods. Now we're prioritizing deep focus, low ISO, which increases makes sure that we're shooting with a maximum dynamic range. We're using SteadyShot to keep the camera very steady in the hands, and we're also moving focus to the foreground. That allows us to get deep focus from objects that are just 1 or 2 meters away from the front of the camera right through to the horizon line. And of course, there will be at least 10 primary settings that are required to register that memory. Let's take a look at quickly changing between 1, 2 and 3, and to give you an idea of how I use this workflow. This was a shoot that I did in Montana, and I've got this horse whisperer with his horse with the snow-capped mountains in the background, and I'm basically using my portrait setting. I've got a 100-400 lens on in this instance, and it's working at the maximum aperture. Now I haven't had to adjust any settings. I've simply dialed the shoot mode dial to number 1, and then I start shooting. And of course, this is also appropriate for a tighter head and shoulder portrait. As I zoom in, the maximum aperture on the lens is f5.6, and so it's just using that maximum aperture. I'm also prioritizing a minimum shutter speed because if he's moving slightly, or if he's on his horse, then I would want to be able to freeze that slow motion. So I'm going to use a minimum shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. Often it'll be much faster than that, but that's the minimum shutter speed I'll allow the camera to use in most instances. And of course, if I start shooting fine detail in the same shoot and I want to isolate detail, I'm still going to be using my portrait setting. It's It's called the portrait setting, but it does use shallow depth of field and it does isolate things from the background. So it's used for more subjects than just head and shoulder portraits. And of course, as soon as Randy jumps onto his horse and starts running around the paddock, here I'm going to move from 1 to 2. Now I'm using a minimum shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second in order to freeze the rapid movement in front of the camera. There are instances where you have to be a little bit smart using this workflow. Like this is a landscape which I would normally shoot with number 3 on the shoot mode dial, but there's an absolute gale blowing at the moment. I want to freeze the fast action of that huge wave hitting the rock on the right side of the image there. So I've switched from using my landscape setting where I'm prioritizing depth of field to using my action settings to freeze the rapid action. Because I'm using a wide angle lens, I've still got enough depth of field for this particular shot because I don't have anything that's really close to the camera lens in this instance. And of course this is another instance where I'm shooting a landscape, but I'm on the Shinkansen, the bullet train in Japan. And it's traveling at over 300 kilometers per hour. So instead of using my landscape setting where I'm prioritizing depth of field, often using a slow shutter speed, this time I'm using my fast shutter speed in my action settings. So again, you have to be a little bit smart about how you use 1, 2 or 3. And again, this is a landscape using my action settings because I'm on a boat that's moving quite quickly, so I want to make sure that there's no camera shake or blur because I'm on a moving vehicle in this instance. Often I'll start with my landscape setting, and this is a classic instance where I need maximum depth of field. The focus point will be closer to the front than the back, and of course, but as soon as I start wanting to isolate details within this location, I quickly switch back to my portrait settings where I can isolate a single flower. So it's called portrait, but it's prioritizing shallow depth of field. And this is great when you want to create that beautiful bokeh in the background. And of course, the closer we go to our subjects, the shallower the depth of field. So this is great for using maybe a short telephoto lens and getting in close and isolating that detail. Okay, so enough examples of this. We'll move forward. This is my landscape setting. As I said, that I'll often prioritize moving the focus to the foreground. So I'll often use an expand spot and position that spot in the lower quadrant of the finder. And in this case, I'm focusing on that book in the foreground. Of course, my f11 aperture ensures that I've got a deep focus right from the foreground right through to the distant subject matter. Of course, if I wanted to do a different approach to this and I wanted to isolate that and blur the background instead of using my landscape setting, I would prioritize my portrait setting for shallow depth of field. Now I will start with often a zone focus area, and I'll just bring that zone focus area to the bottom of the frame, so again it pulls focus on the foreground rather than the background. In this section I'm going to show you how to prepare to register a memory. If you're not using one of my cam set, you're setting the camera up manually, you'll need to do a little bit of preparation before registering a group of settings. So the first thing I would do, just in case you've got anything unusual left in the camera settings, you probably want to start with the defaults. This will make sure that you don't have maybe an odd setting like you've disabled the E front curtain shutter, and you want to start with Sony's defaults. I would go to the setting reset and choose camera settings reset. Avoid using the initialize feature because you'll end up setting the date and place, location in the world where the camera is situated. It's almost like you've taken the camera out of the box for the very first time if you hit that initialize. If you do camera settings reset, it just basically zeroes out all of the main camera settings back to their default values. So this is something I would encourage you to start with. If you do this camera settings reset, then if you're a raw shooter, you'll immediately want to go to your image quality settings and change the JPEG default back to RAW. This obviously is quite an important first step if you don't want to register JPEG shooting in the recall memories that we're about to do. Now, if you've got the Alpha 7.4 and you're registering some stills groups of settings, you will need to turn that sub dial just below the shoot mode dial to the stills icon there, the camera icon. This is currently the only camera this is required because it's the only one that currently has that sub dial there. Now also, if you're working with a camera that's not the Alpha 1 or A9 or Alpha 9.2, you will probably want to just make sure that your silent mode is off and you're working with the mechanical shutter, not the electronic shutter. The cameras featuring stack sensors, such as the A9 cameras and the Alpha 1, those will be using electronic shutters by default, but all of the other cameras will be using the mechanical shutter. Some other things that you need to just ensure is the memories can only control the lens aperture if we set the aperture ring on the lens to A. Now you won't find that letter A on lenses that don't have an aperture ring. You're looking at the GM lenses and the some of the G lenses have that physical aperture ring. Now the memory recall can't set the aperture of the camera if the aperture ring is turned to anything other than A. A lets the camera take control over the aperture. There are a couple of other things on the lens. You just want to make sure that the AF-MF switch is switched to AF, and the OSS, that's the optical steady shot, is also switched to on. Then of course we're ready to start. Now there are some redundant settings in the FN menu. Now I generally on a day-to-day basis rarely if ever go into the main menus, but I will pick up settings that I do want to modify from the starting point 1, 2 or 3 occasionally, and I'll pick those up from the 12 settings I can adjust by accessing the FN menu. Now it is possible to access the FN menu even when using the Finder. Your thumb will just seek out the FN button and the FN menus will appear in the Finder. You don't have to always lower the camera to modify a setting while you're shooting. Now the three of the common, there will be more, but three of the common redundant settings in nearly all of the FN menus by default are drive mode, exposure compensation and ISO. The reason these are redundant, you don't need them in the FN menu, is we have hard physical controls for adjusting those settings. For instance, the drive mode you can access by pressing the left side of that control wheel. If you've got an Alpha 9 or Alpha 1 camera, you'll have a physical dial on the top left side of the camera. We can access ISO by pressing the right side of the control wheel. We can control exposure compensation by moving the exposure compensation dial. Now if you're working with one of the APS-C cameras, exposure compensation will be accessed by pressing the down button on that control. So if we're prepared to replace some of those settings, what would you physically want to replace them with? Some of the settings that I do want to get quick access to via the FN menu or via a custom key are things like ISO, auto, minimum shutter speed. I would love for Sony to by default put that in the FN menu, but you're going to have to put that in manually. So if you've got ISO already in the FN menu and you don't need it because you can press the right side of the control wheel, replace it with ISO auto minimum shutter speed. This allows you to control the minimum shutter speed when you're using aperture priority. So this means that you can avoid using shutter priority mode or manual with a fixed shutter speed setting, you can use aperture priority but control your minimum shutter speed. Now I will put that on the C1 key, but if you've got preferences for your C1 key that is not using ISO auto minimum shutter speed, then just drop it into the FN menu. Subject detection is a big one because I often switch between shooting portraits of humans to shooting portraits of animals, and I want to quickly be able to change from human to animal and from animal to bird. And of course, having the access of that in the FN menu means that I don't need to deep dive into the main menus. Now some of the cameras do have SteadyShot in the FN menu, but quite surprisingly there are many alpha cameras that don't have access to your SteadyShot settings in the FN menu. So if you don't, that's one of the things that I would recommend that you put into the FN menu. Another one is find frame rate. Now the memories can't change the finder frame rate. Now one of the things I will do is I'll set the display quality to high, but I'll only put the finder frame rate menu into the FN menu, and that's because if I switch the finder frame rate to high, it automatically puts the display quality back to standard, and then when I put the finder frame rate back to standard, it automatically puts the display quality back to high. So I only need access to the finder frame rate, not the display quality. If you are going into the FN menu for any reason to make those changes, just leave focus mode and focus area in there. Some of the cameras, the custom key on the top left side of the camera, often C3 key, does have focus mode as a hard physical button. So you may not need focus mode in the FN menu as well. So one of the reasons that I do put finder frame rate in the FN menu is when we're registering a memory, often the Sony cameras will put most of the menu items from the shooting menu, the exposure color, the focus menu, and they'll all be written into the memory. But on the later model cameras, anything in the that yellow toolbox setup menu is not added to the memory, and that includes finder frame rate. Okay, so when we're ready to register a memory, the shoot mode dial will still be in your aperture priority. You may want to be registering a memory using shutter priority or manual, but all three of my PAL settings use aperture priority. So the camera is going to be in aperture priority when we register the memory. You're only recalling the memory by turning the shoot mode dial to 1, 2 or 3. That 1, 2 and 3 on the shoot mode dial is not used for registering a memory. So you'll still be in aperture priority when you're registering your group of settings. Then you'll go into the menus. There's on the right side of this slide you'll see the position of the memory in the older menus used on cameras that predate the Alpha 1 and Alpha 7 IV, and in that lower dialog you can see where that is positioned now in the shooting menu, page 4, camera set memory. You'll then choose a location, 1, 2 or 3. The M1 to M4 settings are saved to a memory card, and those settings are deleted when you format the card. So we're only really interested now in the on-camera memories that will not get deleted when we format the card. So basically you'll just be choosing 1, 2 or 3, and as I said, my portrait go to 1, action to 2, landscape to 3. And once you press that center button on inside the control wheel, you'll get the confirmation that your settings have been registered to the memory. You're now free to recall them quickly just by turning the shoot mode dial to 1, 2 or 3. Now there are starting point settings only, as I've stressed previously, and you might change the settings as you start shooting. You might adjust the aperture, you might adjust the ISO auto minimum shutter speed, you might adjust the subject detection from human to animal. Now you've overridden the default settings, but as soon as you turn the shoot mode dial away from say 1 and then back to 1, the default settings that you registered, which possibly include human as the default settings, will be reinstated. So even though we modify settings, we don't modify the registered memory. We can just reinstate those by simply turning the shoot mode dial away from 1 and then back to 1, or away from 2 and back to 2, etc. Now there are some limitations to the memory and what the memories can control, and they are a little bit more restricted on the Alpha 9 and Alpha 1 cameras. For instance, the memory can't override the drive mode and focus mode on those cameras. It's just the 3 cameras, the Alpha 9, Alpha 9 2 and the Alpha 1. The memories can't override those. So when you do dial in to recall most of your settings, you'll glance down to your drive mode and focus mode to make sure those are appropriately set. For instance, if I'm dialing in Action 2, I might move the drive mode from low to medium or high, so I get more frames per second. You'll also need to double check that you've turned your aperture ring on the lens to A, so the memory recall can override what is the aperture on the lens itself. Now when I am shooting, as I said, I rarely if ever go into the main menus because I have everything at my fingertips basically. I've got my front and rear dials on the front cameras for changing settings such as aperture or shutter speed. I've got my C1 and C2 keys for changing ISO auto minimum shutter speed and focus area. I've got my exposure compensation dial, and I can access the FN menu, and also I can access recall custom hold features, which I'll get into later, by pressing one of the 2 custom keys on the top right side of the camera, which are the AEL key and the AF on buttons there. Now there is only one thing when I've dialed in 1, 2 or 3 on the shoot mode dial that I can't modify, and that is the exposure mode. For instance, if I turn the shoot mode dial to 1 for my portrait settings, I can't switch from using aperture priority to program, because obviously that would require that I turn the shoot mode dial away from 1. As soon as I turn the shoot mode dial away from 1, 2 or 3, I'm no longer using my my registered camera settings. Now if you have installed my cam set and you want to make a small modification to one or more of the registered memories, this is indeed possible. All you have to do is turn the shoot mode dial to 1, 2 or 3, make that change, and then register over the top of my registered memory. And I've got a little video tutorial that showcases how to do that, so that it is modifying a memory, and you'll find that on my YouTube channel. Just a reminder, my portrait settings are using shallow depth of field. They freeze slow movement, so when I'm shooting portraits of people at an event or a parade, I don't have to ask them to be absolutely static. They can even carry on walking because that minimum shutter speed is 1/250th of a second. Now again, when I dial in that, there's a couple of things that I'll just double check. I will check my aperture ring is set to A, the AF/MF switch is set to AF, and the OSS, the SteadyShot, is set to on. I will just double check the subject detection, or I'll rotate that dial away from 1 and back to 1, just to make sure that if I have modified any settings, I'm starting from the known registered values. And one of the things that I can't get the memory to do is that find a frame rate. I'll be using standard frame rate for my portrait and a faster frame rate for my action. Now, I will often register a very wide aperture for my portrait settings. So if I'm using a prime lens such as my 135 prime, I'll often start from the maximum f1.8 aperture. Now when I'm framing a head and shoulders portrait, the depth of field is obviously going to be very narrow with a 135 focal length and maximum aperture, but it's usually sufficient to get the eyeball, the iris, the eyelashes and the eyebrow sharp. I'm only going to start losing focus on one of those items, either the eyebrow or the iris, if I'm very close. I'm cropping in basically to the top of the head. So most of the time the leading eye will be sharp. If the head is slightly turned away, the eye that's a little bit further away from the lens is going to be a little bit in soft focus. If that's not something you want, you will simply wind down the aperture from f1.8 to maybe 2.8 or f4 if you need both eyes sharp. Again, I'm okay with just the leading eye to be sharp. So as soon as I get a semi-profile shot, a three-quarter view on that head, I'm more than happy if the leading eye is sharp. And we can see there that the iris and the eyelashes are sharp at 135 focal length at f1.8. And again at 85mm f1.4, my memory might start at 1.8, but often with a 1.4 aperture lens, I'll move that to f1.4 wider. If both eyes are about the same distance from the camera lens, you might get both eyes sharp even at the f1.4 aperture. Here's the 85 1.4, leading eye sharp, and eye that's further away less sharp. Here's the 50mm f1.2 head and shoulders portrait. We get the leading eye, the eyebrow, the iris and the eyelashes all sharp, even at maximum f1.2 aperture. Now you can force to lose focus on one of those three items. Here I'm going in closer on that same subject by simply stepping in one step closer to my subject. And now what you can see is the eyelashes and iris are still sharp, but the eyebrow is now out of focus. Okay, and so that is where you might want to just stop the aperture down. We don't always have to shoot maximum aperture if we just need to pull a little bit of extra focus. Just remember the depth of field decreases the closer we go to our subject, so we can still get very narrow depth of field even with f1.8 or f2 when we step that close. Now some people might say, why are you using aperture priority and ISO auto minimum shutter speed? Because I just use manual exposure and auto ISO. It's still an automated exposure mode when you're using ISO auto with the manual shoot mode. Okay, and I'll give you a couple of reasons why I prefer aperture priority and ISO auto minimum shutter speed over manual exposure mode and ISO auto. So when I'm working with a wide aperture lens, such as the 85mm f1.4 at maximum aperture, I've set the minimum preferred shutter speed to 1/250th of a second. But because I'm working in bright ambient lighting, yes, I've set the minimum shutter speed to 1/250th, but the actual shutter speed used is 1/8000th of a second in this instance. And that is to protect the exposure. Obviously the ISO can't go below ISO 100, so the only way it can reduce exposure if I've set the aperture to maximum aperture is to increase the shutter speed. Now if you're using manual exposure mode and you set your minimum shutter speed to 1/250th, you'd find yourself 5 stops overexposed, so you'd be constantly having to adjust the shutter speed. With ISO auto minimum shutter speed, that is happening automatically for me. So if I'm working in slightly less bright conditions, here I'm under a bridge, and so we're quite a few stops darker, but even though I've set the minimum shutter speed to 1/250th, it's still bright enough using a wide aperture lens to keep the shutter speed higher than my minimum shutter speed, which is 1/250th. This was captured with a 35mm f1.4. This is in the rain, still way above my 1/250th minimum. This time now it's floated to 1/640th. I'm not having to make these decisions. The camera is making these adjustments to the shutter speed for me. Okay, so again, we've got movement, and even though the shutter speed is 1/250th, this guy could start running towards me, and I'm still going to freeze that movement because the actual shutter speed in this instance was 1,250th of a second. And there it is, 3,200th of a second. And here now I'm using not a wide aperture prime, but a 100-400 with a maximum aperture of f5.6, and it's still floating above my 1/250th of a minimum, and it's still holding on to that ISO 100 value. If I do need to increase my shutter speed because I find that the action is probably a little bit faster, and I'll just press my C1 key, which is I've programmed for ISO auto minimum shutter speed, and I'll just raise the minimum shutter speed from 1/250th to 1/500th. As I've said, the actual shutter speed is probably still higher than this because we're working in bright sunlit conditions. Here's what happens when we're working in conditions that are not very bright at all. This is a nighttime shot. Now what happens is when your ISO auto range has hit the maximum that you've decided on, that could be ISO 6400 or something lower or something higher, but when that maximum is reached, then what the camera has to do, even though you've set 1/250th as the minimum shutter speed, in order to protect exposure, the shutter speed will start to go slower than your recommended minimum. It only does this when your ISO has hit that maximum value, however. Okay, so let's take a look at depth of field decisions, because the registered memory uses a very wide aperture, but occasionally I will want to stop down. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. For instance, my shallow depth of field is ideal for a single person, a single head and shoulders portrait. But of course, if we're shooting more than one person, we'll need the depth of field to be a little bit greater, because the camera can't focus on two people at different distances at the same time. It can only focus on one distance. So your subjects need to be exactly the same distance from the camera to be sharp if the aperture is wide open, or we do need to stop down. Sometimes if you can't judge whether the people are the same distance, then I would recommend just stopping down just to be sure. So here my default starting point settings would be f1.8, but because this is two people, I've just stopped down to f4. Now this was actually captured at a parade, and my first shot of these two girls was captured with maximum aperture, but as I move in closer and the depth of field decreases, I'm not taking any chances now. I'm winding the aperture smaller. Now sometimes I don't look at exactly what aperture I'm closing down to. Now I know that there's 3 clicks of the rear dial to move that aperture smaller, so usually just 2 swipes to the right will close the aperture down from maximum f1.8 aperture to f4 or f5.6, and that will usually be sufficient to get two people who are not exactly the same distance from the camera lens to both be sharp. And as you can see in this instance, that's worked out in this instance. So f4 might be a good starting place for two people who you think are approximately the same distance from the camera. But when in the situation where we have on the right, where we've got the person in the distance is 2 or 3 steps back from the person in the foreground, again I'm going to have to increase the depth of field by moving the aperture even smaller. Now I've moved it to f8 to ensure both people are sharp in this one. And again, if that person in the distance gets even further away, I'm going to move down to f11 just to be sure. Here's an instance where I've moved very close to this family of monkeys, and as you move closer, the depth of field decreases. So I've stopped down from f1.8 to 5.6. In this instance, it's almost been enough to get all three monkeys in sharp focus. The monkey in the top, the whiskers on the mouth and the eyebrows are sharp enough, but the eyes are just going a little bit soft, and that's because the depth of field isn't quite sufficient. And again, so f5.6 was close, f8 would have got all three. But of course this was captured in the rain, so I'm also wary of the ISO climbing too high, so been a little bit cautious in this to protect ISO rather than increase the depth of field. I'm starting with zone as my default starting focus area, but there are going to be instances where I want to modify the focus area. Now, by default, the C2 key on the top of most alpha cameras controls focus area, and I can change the focus area while the camera finder is still at my eye. It only takes a couple of seconds. It is one of the most frequently changed settings apart from ISO, auto, minimum shutter speed, so I do like my C1 and C2 keys to control these frequently changed camera settings. So one of the things that I love doing with shallow depth of field is getting background blur but also foreground blur. So I'll often shoot past somebody in the foreground to create shallow depth of field or blurred subjects in front of the subject as well as behind the subject. Now the zone focus area is a good starting point because it ensures that so long as the person on the side of the frame that is not my primary target, so long as they don't get too close to the center of the frame, that zone focus area positioned in the center will always pick the person in the center of that zone. And if you've got IAF enabled, which it should be for my portrait settings, then the IAF will take over from the zone as soon as it detects the eye inside of that zone area. Now if the face is outside of that zone, you might need to move the zone towards the face so before IAF will engage. Once it's engaged and you've got the tracking zone as your focus area, it doesn't really matter what happens in front of the camera then. The camera will try to hold on to the subject. Now my tracking sensitivity is set to 1 locked on, which is the stickiest setting. So that means that people can walk in front of the camera lens and the camera will hold focus on that primary target that I first acquired for much longer than if I set the tracking sensitivity to number 5 responsive. 5 responsive might be useful if different people are jumping in front of the camera and you want them the camera to snap focus, but if you're wanting the camera to stay focusing on just the first person, then that 1 locked on is definitely the setting you will be looking for. And in this instance, this sequence of 5 images, you can see somebody's walked in front of the camera, but it's held focus on my primary target throughout the sequence. So I wouldn't have acquired the focus in this particular frame. I would have acquired the focus so that when a flag is waved in front of the camera, it carries on holding focus on my primary target. And this is obviously one of the great advantages of the late model cameras that started arriving in 2019 later, that moved from the lock-on AF to the AF tracking. The new algorithms were much stickier at staying with the subject. Here's the Alpha 6400, the first camera to feature the new algorithms, and you can see I've acquired the subject in the top left frame so that when the dancer's arm appears in front of the camera lens, the camera doesn't get distracted. Here it's tracking the dancer with IAF, but if the arm goes in front of the eye, the camera doesn't get distracted by something that is closer to the camera. It stays at the distance to the nearest thing that was close to the eye before the eye became obscured. Again, just to showcase why the zone is often all I need for most instances, not all, but most instances. You can see that I've got somebody closer to the camera on the left and right side of the frame, but because they're not really entering the zone too much, the camera will focus on the person inside that focus area. They don't have to be absolute center of the zone, just appearing inside of that zone, and then the IAF will take over. Again, you can see there's some blur right at the bottom of the frame, but again the zone ignores that and will pick out the person inside of that zone, and the IAF again taking over. And you'll find even if the arm is in front of the camera, when you acquire the subject, usually if the eye is quite visible, the camera will ignore the out-pointed arm and finger and just go straight to the face, ignoring the outstretched arm. Sometimes you might find that even in profile view with the eye closed, you might find, so long as the eye is inside of the zone, you might find the tracking taking over and the IF engaged. If the eye needs to be visible, you'll see it switch from the IAF icon to the tracking icon in most instances. And here you can see we've got some prayer flags floating in front of the camera lens, creating that misty washed out look, but the camera carries on tracking my primary target. And here, a guy standing behind an open doorway, the camera just ignores the subject that's closer to the lens and goes straight to my primary target. Again, you've got somebody on the right side just entering the zone, but it's not enough into the zone for the camera to get confused. So again, it just goes straight to my primary target. I will actually seek out people that are close to the camera and try and shoot past them, because I love this layered approach to my portrait work, which I do at events and parades and demonstrations, and you get an idea. I'm just showing you many examples of how I work my portraits with foreground, shallow, out of focus subjects, and my primary target in sharp focus. Okay, so I think you get the idea, and always acquiring the subject when we've got clean line of sight, and then allowing foreground subjects to get closer to that zone when required. And so I'll show you a sequence here. Once that's acquired, I'll just move around the subjects, looking through gaps, and to carry on tracking my primary target. And as you can see, doing a good job most of the time. There are going to be instances where I want to move the focus area. Now there are only 9 possible positions for that zone, so it's not as arduous as moving a spot around where we get the multi-selector or the press the left or right side of the control wheel on an APS-C camera to move that zone. Quickly, just one press to the right moves the zone from the central position to the right, and that's done in this instance because I want an off-center composition, and we've got that person on the left getting close to the central position. So I've just moved the zone over to the right, and then I quickly acquire focus. Now there are going to be some instances where I do want to reduce the size of the focus area. Often that's just reducing it from the zone through to the expand spot, and that will be just moving that rear dial. If you're using the tracking focus areas, you'll just move that rear dial to the right in order to select the expand spot. These will be instances where we've got, I'm just trying to pick out a subject in amongst many subjects, and my line of sight now is obscured by foreground subjects that will probably be inside of that zone focus area. So in this instance, I've just reduced the size of the focus area. Now you will need to get that spot focus area somewhere near the head. It doesn't have to be on the eye, but somewhere near the head, and then the IAF will engage. as long as you've got near the face. It doesn't have to be on the eye. And this is another instance where we've got I'm looking over somebody's shoulder. The zone focus area would almost certainly snap focus on the ear or the hand and not the camera the guy is holding. So I've just reduced the size of the focus area to a spot and then move that spot onto my precise target that I want the camera to start tracking. Now when I'm inside the number 1 on the portrait settings, I record them. If I want to modify my setting by changing from human to animal, I will do that with the camera at my eye. I won't lower the camera. I will simply press the FN button with my thumb. I will use the multi-selector to navigate to subject detection, which is in the FN menu. It's not there by default. I remember I've added it to my FN menu. And then without pressing the multi-selector in, I just then rotate the front dial to switch from human to animal and then animal to bird. Now if you're using one of the APS-C cameras that doesn't have a multi-selector, you'll be navigating using the rear control wheel, and that's the only point of difference there. Again, you don't really need to press the center button on that control wheel. If you've been navigating using the control wheel, you just have to move the target to your subject detection. You're then free to use the front or rear dial in order to control it. If again you don't have a front dial on your alpha camera, you'll just rotate the control wheel to change from human to animal. Of course, it is important to do that when you're framing up an animal with a long snout, because you don't want sharp pictures of animals' noses, which the camera without animal IF will want to do. It'll want to give you a pin sharp photograph of the front of the dog's nose. So of course, as soon as the camera detects that it is an animal, it will push back beyond the nose towards the animal's leading eye, which is what it's done in this instance. And of course that's important even if we're not using very wide apertures, but we're using long telephoto lenses such as this 600mm focal length, maximum aperture of 6.3. The front of the animal's nose will still be out of focus if we've framed up a tight head and shoulder portrait. And again, this is the 400 2.8 maximum aperture. The front of this kangaroo's nose is slightly soft, but the leading eye is pin sharp. And of course this is super important. Now the animal IF is super reliable. I think it does recognize most but not all animals, so you might occasionally have to move to a spot focus point if your animal IF doesn't kick in automatically. Now with the very latest Sony cameras, it is possible to have AF tracking and animal eye AF at the same time. On older alpha cameras, you'll find that you have a decision to make. You have to use or select animal eye AF, but you can't have the lock-on AF. You have to use one or the other. In those instances where you've got rapid motion, I would prioritize lock-on AF over animal IF. But as I said, with later model cameras such as the Alpha 1, Alpha 7C, Alpha 7.4, you can have both at the same time, tracking and animal IF. And of course that might be super important when you've got shots like this that you're framing up. And of course super reliable if a bird is very close to you, that the camera knows where the bird's eye is. Now bird IF is not quite as reliable as animal IF, but when it does work, it is super useful to have. As we can see on this Alpha 7.4, got a very distinctive eye on this particular bird, a wattle bird in Australia, and so the camera has snap focus even though the bird is in full flight. Now the bird eye, as I said, is super useful when we've got a distinctive eye, such as again this seagull. There are some birds where the eye is less distinctive, a dark eye in amongst dark feathers, and again you're going to have to just rely on maybe zone focus and then just focus on the entire bird, which might be slightly problematic if it picks up the leading wing and you're very close, and then you've got a wing that's close to the camera that's in sharp focus and the eye is slightly soft. I find the bird eye is also particularly useful when working close and the bird is surrounded by, in this case we've got tall grass. In most instances it will be branches that are closer to the camera than the bird. If the camera does detect it's a bird, it ignores the branches or the grass, pushes back and gives you a shot, an easier shot than having to manually put a small spot on a bird's eye. And of course I am pleasantly surprised that it's not just the more common birds that it picks. It has recognized this large emu in Australia, and of course I'm working with very shallow depth of field, so it's super useful to have on this 400mm 2.8 when working at maximum aperture. Now let's take a look at my action settings. These, the default settings are to freeze fast action. Not all sports photographers will want to freeze, and we'll go into that and touch on that subject, but that's where I like to start. So we'll be using a fast shutter speed. We'll be tracking the fast action and we'll be shooting in continuous shooting mode. There will be some things I'll want to check when dialing in number 2, especially if I've got an Alpha 1 or Alpha 9 camera. If I've got one of those cameras, I'll just check the focus mode and drive mode setting. I might want to move the drive mode from low to medium to high, or even high plus, in order to get the maximum frames per second. Now with a lot of sporting lenses we have steady shot on the lenses, but we also have steady shot modes, and if you're going to be panning the camera to follow a subject, then you really need to switch from mode 1, which is often used when the camera is steady, to mode 2, which is more suited for panning the camera. If the motion of the camera is very erratic, you'll move from 2 to steady shot mode 3. Again, some of the late model Sony zoom lenses do have an aperture as ring as well, so you will need just to check that you've switched that aperture ring to A, so the memory can control the aperture. And of course, finally, that find a frame rate, you will want to go into your FN menu and choose the faster frame rate. This means that you're getting a faster frame rate in the finder, so we're going to have less lag when we're actually rapidly panning the camera to follow a moving subject. So we've touched on mode 2. Really that should be your default setting if you're a sports photographer. Often the camera, if it's the lens, if it's set to steady shot mode 1, you're basically telling the lens that you're intending to keep the camera still, and obviously that is not what you're trying to do when you're panning with a flying bird. So mode 2 really should be almost the default setting on some of these sporting lenses, because for most sporting photographers you are moving the camera. So that 1/2000th of a second is going to freeze a bird in flight. If the ambient conditions are sufficiently bright, you may even want to move to an even faster shutter speed. So press the C1 key and move from 1/2000th of a second to 1/4000th of a second if you've got a rapidly moving bird, maybe a smaller bird with rapidly moving wings. Now I would start with a zone focus area, but if you're having trouble acquiring the subject in the center or roughly the center of the frame, then you might want to change the wide focus area, the zone focus area to a wide focus area. Then what will happen is if the camera will latch on to your subject, as long as it's the closest subject to the camera, the wide will pick up your subject even if it's at the edge of the frame when you you acquire the subject. It might move around the frame as you start tracking that, and then the tracking will take over, but it might just make the subject acquisition a bit easier if we acquire it with the wide focus area. Now, there are too many DSLR users who are not used to selecting a wide focus area, because let's face it, the wide focus area on those DSLRs was not very wide at all. But of course, on these Sony cameras, the wide focus area, especially the late model Sony Alpha cameras, the wide focus area covers almost the entire sensor. So you would pick up this particular bird in flight using the wide focus area, where a DSLR user may miss the bird still using wide. Now, again, you don't always have to have the subject in the center of the frame if we're picking up wide. Wide is a very reliable focus area so long as we don't have any subjects closer to the camera. So it'll nearly always make light work of subject acquisition. So in instances where I'm capturing dogs running towards the camera on the beach, wide is a great focus area to use. I don't even need to use zone, which I often start with, especially with the portrait settings, but I'll often switch to wide when appropriate, such as tracking a cyclist coming towards the lens. If it's out from a pack of cyclists, it will just pick the cyclist. I'm not choosing which cyclist, it'll just pick the cyclist and then track that really close to the camera. Now, I'm using the fast shutter speed, and this is really appropriate where I've cropped into the cycle. Often though, you don't want to use a very fast shutter speed when you're tracking moving vehicles in motorsports or these type of sporting events. You want some background blur so your subject doesn't look like it's stopped, and so we will look at that shortly. Occasionally that zone will come into use. Here I'm showing an example where zone was more useful when I was shooting at this rodeo, and often horses would be closer to the action that I'm actually targeting. So for the camera to ignore the horse towards the left of the frame, I'm having to use a smaller focus area and then position that focus area away from the center of the frame. There will be instances where instead of using wide or zone, I'll actually start with an expand spot, a tracking expand spot. I'll actually put that tracking spot on the bird while it's still perched, and I'll position or compose the frame, so I expect the bird to take off and move to the right of the frame, but there'll always be a little bit of delay between the bird moving and me starting to pan the camera. So in this instance, what has happened is the camera is still in its original position, but already the camera is tracking the bird away from its original position, and it's about this time when the bird hits this part in the frame, I will start moving the camera, and then I will try and keep the bird in the frame. A little bit surprising, sometimes these large raptors have a wingspan much larger than you expect, as you can see, so maybe a little bit of a wider framing would have been recommended in this instance. Okay, so I did say a choice of tracking sensitivity. Now my starting point settings will be locked on, so this always ensures that once I've acquired the subject, if things get in the way of the camera lens or my subject disappears behind another subject momentarily, the locked on setting, tracking sensitivity setting, will ensure that it ignores obstacles that momentarily appear that are closer. Now, as I said, you may only want to move to number 5, responsive, if you do want the camera to jump to a different subject. Think of an empty frame that was tracking somebody, and then somebody different jumps in front of the frame. If you wanted the camera to immediately jump focus to that person, you would set it to responsive rather than number 1, locked on. Now, a lot of people who are used to shooting sports will say, Mark, you're still using aperture priority with ISO auto minimum shutter speed. Surely, most photographers use shutter priority to shoot sports because shutter is the priority. You'll even find some photographers use manual exposure with ISO auto, but I still have my reasons for using aperture priority with ISO auto minimum shutter speed, so I can control both aperture and minimum shutter speed and let the ISO do the auto exposure for me. So to give you a couple of examples, I've set the minimum shutter speed from 1/2000th of a second. In this instance, I've lowered it to 1/500th of a second. So I've overridden my default settings simply by pressing the C1 key and reducing from 1/2000 to 1/500. That just gives me a little bit of movement drag on the racetrack this rider is riding over, so it doesn't look like the bike has fallen over and stopped. It looks like the bike is moving rapidly. Now in this instance I've lowered the minimum shutter speed to 1/250th, but if you look at the actual shutter speed in the lower right hand side, it's actually 1/320th of a second, so it's a little bit faster than the minimum shutter speed. And the reason it's done that is to protect the exposure. The camera has worked out that the white highlights will be a little bit too bright, and so it's used the nearest shutter speed to my recommended minimum in order to protect exposure. So in this instance it's done a great thing for me, and had I been using shutter priority, I possibly would have overexposed the highlights in this instance. And of course I'll often, with slower moving motorcycles such as this one here, I'll often slow down the shutter speed even below 1/250th of a second. So here I've slowed it down to 1/30th of a second. Sometimes this can be problematic in full sun, but you might need to put an ND filter in front of your lens, but this is in a dark laneway in Vietnam, so I've got no problem having the camera slow down to 1/30th of a second. Just remember, once you're trying to reduce exposure, the camera can't use ISOs below 100 ISO. So there are going to be instances where there is still too much light to hit that 1/30th per second, and if that's the case, it'll just use the nearest shutter speed. If that's 1/125th of a second, so be it, but it does give me an opportunity to think about putting an ND filter on if I really need those slow shutter speeds. Now the great thing about mirrorless cameras is when we're looking and monitoring exposure, the view that we're seeing in the finder or on the monitor, it's a what you see is what you get view. So if things are starting to look a little bit too bright, the highlights might be looking like they're overexposing. They look too bright in the finder, and that leads us to use the exposure compensation dial on the top of the camera. On an APS-C camera, that would be pressing the bottom of the control wheel and then using your rear dial to modify exposure, or pressing the left and right side of that control wheel. So often when we're shooting birds in flight, if you're just using the meter as red exposure, but you've got a bright sky behind the bird, often the camera will underexpose because of the amount of bright tones. So we often have to raise the exposure compensation dial to +1 or more to compensate for that very bright sky. It ensures that we don't underexpose our primary subject. And the opposite is true. If we've got a very dark background, we might find ourselves having to lower the exposure compensation dial. And this is really more important in this instance, because if the camera keeps the standard exposure, there is a risk of overexposing the white plumage on this white owl here. So using that negative exposure compensation when we're dealing with dark backgrounds is often very important. There are very few instances where I actually come out of my memory recall settings 1, 2 and 3. This is perhaps one of the most common reasons that I do exit number 2, and that is when I've got birds in flight and the background is changing from very bright skies to maybe dark trees very rapidly. So I can't really follow the exposure compensation as quickly as I would like. There is a camera setting to lock the exposure, automatic exposure lock with shutter. That is something you can look into. It's set to auto by default, but you might want to switch that on if you don't want to start using manual exposure mode. So, but I will often come out and use manual exposure mode, and these will be my starting settings when there's sunlight involved, i.e. the sunlight striking my primary target, and that is f6.3 at 1/2000th of a second at ISO 320. Now if we've got a problem because maybe the subject isn't lit by sunlight, now my zebra display will be on by default if you've loaded my cam set. So you'll get zebras appearing in very bright highlights such as white clouds in the sky. Now this will lead you, if you are working in manual exposure, to simply lower the ISO or increase the ISO until you got the optimum exposure for that particular lighting condition. So I would typically raise the ISO until I see the zebras appear, and then back off, basically lower the ISO until the zebras disappear, and there will be your optimum exposure. Remember, if you're working with birds in flight, just always think about the white plumage might be a little bit brighter than those white clouds in the sky, so always be a little bit cautious when working with that exposure compensation using the ISO settings. Okay, so these are classic instances where I'm tracking a bird in flight. It's moving from the right side where the foliage was very dark behind, and it's on its way to being backlit by the very bright sky. And this ensures that the exposure doesn't change. The sunlight striking the bird is a constant, but the background tones are changing, and that's where manual exposure with manual ISO really come into their own. And so these instances where I do have dark trees in the background, these are the instances where I do come out of my action settings number 2. Let's take a closer look at my handheld landscape settings now. Now this is prioritizing deep focus. We're maintaining the optimum ISO. The lower I can keep the ISO, the bigger the dynamic range. Big dynamic range is really important for making sure that I've got full detail running through from very dark shadows right through to the brightest highlights. Dynamic range does reduce as the ISO gets higher. And I also want to move focus to the foreground rather than have it way back in the background of the image. We're going to get the maximum depth of field if the focus point is closer to the camera. We rarely, if ever, want to be focusing on the horizon line or distant mountains when we're shooting landscapes. Other things to check is we dial in number 3 on the shoot mode dial. Again, if you're using an alpha 9 or alpha 1, you want to look at your drive mode setting. You might want to not be shooting in 20 frames per second anymore. You might want to turn that to single shooting mode. You're also going to be checking your lens. Again, is turned to A. It's always important to turn the lens to A before turning the shoot mode dial to 1, 2 or 3. If you do it in reverse order, the camera has a funny habit of selecting F4 for some reason better known to Sony. So if you're wanting the memory to select F11 or F1.8, dial in A on the lens first, then dial in your memory recall. Now SteadyShot will be on. You might need to check that is on the lens. If the lens doesn't have a SteadyShot setting, then it will be on in the main menus, and that is covered by the memory. The finder frame rate goes down from high down to standard, and that will put the display quality of the finder back up to high quality. Now there are occasions where you'll want to come out of autofocus into manual focus, and you want the menu to cover MF assist. That's where you turn the focus ring and you automatically get a magnified view to help you fine-tune focus. So that would be something that is covered by my memory settings. If you're registering your own memory, that is something you'll want to consider. A perspective and choice of lens. Obviously my memory recall can't change the lens for you, so you are going to make a decision about whether you want steep perspective or compressed perspective. So your wide angle lenses give you this rapid fall off and very what's called steep perspective, creating this very dynamic image where the foreground looks very close to the lens and the background looks very far away. So often when we're using these ultra wide angle lenses, your hero element in the landscape does need to be something in the foreground or middle distance, because everything in the background is pushed much further away, and this is something that I cover in my landscape masterclass. So you can see all of these shot with ultra wide angle lenses, we're getting that distant subject matter pushed well back. Now your focus point does need to be quite close to the camera in these instances, and I'll deal with that shortly. There are instances, however, where you don't want steep perspective, you want compressed perspective. Here I'm creating more of a two-dimensional image rather than a deep image, and this is where the longer telephoto lenses come into their own, where we're flattening everything out rather than increasing the depth. And there are instances where this creates a compelling narrative rather than always using the ultra wide angle focal lengths. So here in this urban environment, it's creating this very dense feeling to these high-rise apartment living. So this gives me exactly the narrative or communication I want, rather than having all of the buildings look like they're separated out by great distances. So the same thing is true of a bamboo forest. For instance, here I'm compressing perspective. I think I'm using an 85mm focal length in this instance, and this really makes the forest seem impenetrable. But of course, if I want to change the communication, I just put on an ultra wide angle lens, and then you can imagine somebody wandering through this particular bamboo forest, because it's not as thick as the image on the right would seem to infer. The other thing to consider, of course, with landscape is depth of field. One of my priority settings is an f11 aperture, because I want to start with more focus, more depth of field. I don't want to have that same shallow depth of field, which is prioritized by my number one portrait setting. So often f11 will give me what I need. I know there are smaller apertures, but often the lens is performing at its sharpest if we can get by with shooting with f8 or f11. Here I'm showing you how much depth of field you can achieve with just using an f11 aperture. This was captured with a 25mm focal length lens, and everything from the immediate foreground right through to the Queen Mary 2 is in sharp focus. Now if I often refer to this as 11 feet to infinity. This is you're only going to achieve this, however, if you've focused at the correct position in the frame. So we would not be focusing on the Queen Mary. We'll be focusing just a few meters away from the front of the lens. Now obviously we don't need to stop down quite as much when working with APS-C lenses. You'll get as much depth of field on an APS-C sensor at f8 as you would with a full frame sensor working with an aperture of f12. And of course you don't want to be using f11 or even f16 if you don't need to. So and of course if you are working even the little 1-inch sensor cameras such as the RX100 cameras, the RX10 cameras, they're using what's called a 1-inch sensor, and the crop factor on these cameras using these much smaller sensors is using an aperture of f4 on these cameras is equivalent to using an aperture of f11 on the full frame cameras. So there's very little reason often to stop down beyond f4 when using these crop sensor cameras, and that's also important for keeping the ISO low, because obviously the huge strength of these crop sensor cameras is not high ISO performance. It's more about portability and weight, and so usually you can get all of the depth of field you require, and you can keep the ISO at 100 just by stopping down no more than f4. Of course, when we're working with telephoto lenses and there is no immediate foreground, everything is more than 100 meters away, often we don't need to be stopping the lens down to f11 again either, and we can just use an f5.6 or f8 aperture and have corner to corner sharpness. So as long as everything is pretty much more than 150 meters away, you're going to be pretty safe to be using these wider apertures on these telephoto lenses. Hyperfocal distance is a subject that I cover in my masterclass. I'll just go into it very briefly here. So if you're looking at this forest scene, and I'm capturing this with a 20mm prime lens, everything is sharp, but where exactly am I choosing to focus? Sometimes it's easier just to switch the AF/MF switch to manual focus and dial in the hyperfocal distance for that lens. Now I'm using a depth of field calculator on CambridgeInColor.com, color spelt in the English way with a U rather than the American way without the U in the word color. And here I've dialed in my sensor size, full frame, my aperture, my focal length, my focus distance. I've clicked on the advanced settings so I actually get the hyperfocal distance readout, and I can see that with the 20mm lens I'm really quite safe to use a focus distance of just 3 meters, and everything just 1.5 meters from the camera will be in sharp focus if I've just focused at 3 meters on this lens. If I need a little bit more of a close focusing distance, because I think my foreground subject is just a little bit closer, I might focus at a 2 meter distance and stop down to f16. Now with 1.22 meters away, if you were standing and you were angling down like I was with that forest scene, everything in front of your feet is going to be in sharp focus right through to the most distant subject matter in the frame. If you are working with maybe a more typical 16-35 zoom lens at the 16mm focal length, you'll find that you can move the hyperfocal distance just a little bit closer. Here an example of 2 meters at f11, and everything to just under 1 meter away, 3 feet away, is in sharp focus. Now these hyperfocal distance, they are a variable figure. You can move that optimum hyperfocal distance further or closer to the camera depending on your max print dimension. I'm choosing 26 inches in this particular example, but in other instances you'll see me use max print dimensions of 30 inches or more. So 26 inches pretty much good for a large 4K monitor. Interestingly, on the example on the right, I'm using an 18mm Batis, and so the focal length is set to 18. Now, interestingly, when I move the focus ring, I can see the focus readout in the finder and on the monitor, but in the little LED readout on the Batis lens, I'm actually given a much more precise focusing distance, and I get a readout in 2.4, 2.5, 2.6, and I can find the optimum hyperfocal distance when using that Batis lens is actually not 2 meters, not 3 meters, but 2.5 meters, and that is one of the great features of that little Batis 18mm prime lens, which is great if you love dialing in your hyperfocal distance. Of course, if we're using focal lengths even wider than 16mm, you get extra depth of field when working with focal lengths wider than 16mm. And so if you ever checked out my 1224 G Master review, I pretty much shot with the entire review process with the aperture set at its maximum f2.8 aperture. And this is one such example which was captured at 2.8, and you can see how much depth of field you actually get at that 12mm focal length. So this is another one of those instances where you often don't find yourself having to stop down much beyond f4 or 5.6 when using a 12mm focal length. And there is an example here of the depth of field calculator. Okay, so that basically covers the hyperfocal distance. That's when I come out of AF and start moving to MF, which might be quicker than just choosing something to focus on. So let's take a look at SteadyShot, handheld or tripod. This is often a common question, is when the camera does go on a tripod, what do you do with that SteadyShot setting? So it's great to have the 5-axis in-body image stabilization. If you have OSS in the lens, the two work together. If you do have a lens with OSS, you might find the SteadyShot setting on the camera menu is grayed out because it wants you to control SteadyShot on the lens, not the camera. So this is where in my registered memory I've moved from the standard ISO auto minimum shutter speed to slow and slower. What this does is there's a reciprocal relationship between shutter speed and focal length. So at a 50mm focal length, the minimum shutter speed, if set to standard, is 1/50th of a second. If we move up that to a 100mm focal length, we'd have a 100mm minimum shutter speed. What tends to happen when using wide angle lenses, however, it stops following that reciprocal rule. So when we use a 30mm lens, it doesn't use a 1/30th of a second. It carries on using 1/50th of a second, as if the camera doesn't have SteadyShot. So most people, as long as they haven't been drinking too many coffees that day or don't have shake in their hands, as long as you can adopt a wide stance and hold the camera steady, and you can press the shutter release slowly, you can find that you might be able to go down slower than the recommended minimum. When you go from standard to slow, your shutter speed will be halved, and when you go from slow to slower, it will be halved again. So 1/30th becomes 1/15th, 1/15th becomes 1/8th, and when using these wide angle lenses such as 20mm or 16mm, I find that I can handhold 1/8th of a second, so long as I'm being careful to hold the camera steady. And so this is pretty much a nighttime shot of one of the tall buildings in London, and I'm shooting this at night handheld without using a tripod, and I've only raised the ISO to ISO 1000. So I find many photographers are actually putting the cameras on tripods when you could actually hand hold. For instance, this is at f11. The ISO auto minimum shutter speed is slowed down to 1/30th of a second, and I'm still at my optimum ISO 100 setting here, and the sun has only just risen. So one would question, why would you put the camera on a tripod when I'm nowhere near 1/8 of a second? I could go even slower, but I'm comfortably hand holding 1/30th of a second. I'm also showing here moving the focus point. I'm still using AF, and I'm moving the focus point to the foreground. I don't want the AF to focus on that distant lake in the background, so I will want to move the focus point to something maybe 3-4 meters away from the camera to get my optimum depth of field. Same with this one. Is the camera is handheld. I'm moving the expand spot. It usually start with my registered memory in the lower third of the frame. I might just have to move the multi-select just to move it 1 or 2 clicks lower, so that I can pick up the rocks that are just 3-4 meters away, rather than and you might even focus on something that is just 2 meters away or 6 feet away from the lens. And if you're doing that at f11 or f16, you will be assured to get all of the distant horizon line sharp as well. Here's another example using 1/8 of a second handheld, and again moving that focus point to something which I estimate to be 2, 3, 4 meters from the camera. Here I am with a 200mm focal length now. There isn't any immediate foreground, so even though the starting point for that expand spot is in the lower third, it probably doesn't need to be moved very far away from the registered point, and it doesn't really matter if I focus on the distant subject, because there is no foreground that needs to be pulled into sharp focus with depth of field. So again, here showing the focus point is closer to the camera. I might move it over to the left or right side to some of the graffiti if there's not enough information for the camera to pull focus on the footpath. But again, if the camera does focus there, I'll possibly just leave it there. If you are using a lens that doesn't communicate its focal length with the camera, you will need to go into the SteadyShot Settings and switch from auto to manual and dial in the focal length of the lens. Some of the non-Sony lenses do communicate their focal length. Just look for the contacts on the back of the lens that are communicating the focal length. If there are no electrical contacts on the back of that lens, then no information is being communicated to the camera, so that means you will have to set the focal length of that lens manually, which is what I'm doing here with this Laowa lens. Okay, a word about the smaller apertures such as f16 and f22. Okay, I'll just read from the slide here. Light begins to disperse or diffract when passing through small apertures. Very small apertures such as f22 may in some instances produce less sharp images than f16 or f11. It is sometimes necessary, however, to sacrifice sharpness at the focal plane in exchange for increased depth of field. So I'm not saying never use f22. Okay, in this instance I actually did use f22 because I realized I'd forgotten my ND filters and I really wanted to smooth the water out as much as possible. So I closed down from beyond f11 to f22. I used a manual ISO setting of ISO 50 just to pull in a 4-second exposure. Now if you were being super critical and you zoom to 100%, you might say, oh, the buildings on that skyline are not as sharp as they could be. But I have to warn you that most people will not notice. Okay, it's only people who are standing very close to a very large print or who have magnified a very high resolution image on a monitor who will possibly be able to pick that you've stopped down beyond f11 to f22. Okay, another word about D-Range Optimizer. My registered memory has D-Range Optimizer set to auto. What this does is it automatically lightens the dark shadows in the Finder and Monitor, but it doesn't write these lightened shadows to a raw file. So when you open the raw file, your shadows look darker than you remember. You have to lighten those shadows manually by raising the shadow slider. I have to stress the optimum exposure is not guided by the shadow values but by the highlight values. This is where you choose the optimum exposure. So the optimum exposure is the brightest exposure that doesn't overexpose the very bright sky. I find the D-Range Optimizer on to be useful because it stops me seeing silhouettes when I'm framing up the composition. It shows me an image that's closer to the edited view. Even though I know the shadows might open up a little bit darker in Lightroom, I'm happy to have that lightened view in the camera finder and on the camera monitor. And then of course in post-production I might pull down the highlights, open up the shadows, add a little bit of contrast and process. So I'm exposing for the highlights and processing for the shadows. There will be instances, and it's not common, but most of my landscapes are shot handheld, but there are going to be some instances where I want to move the camera from handheld to a tripod. Usually when I want to do this is there's either water I want to smooth out using an ND filter, or the sun has not yet risen or has already set, so we're moving into blue hour from golden hour. So if you are using my registered memory, there are just 3 or 4 modifications you need to do. Okay, so one is to start with the registered memory for handheld, so select 3 on the shoot mode dial. 2, press the right side of the control wheel and set the ISO from auto to 100. Set the SteadyShot to off, especially if you're using long exposures with telephoto lenses. If you're using a Sony wide angle lens, if you forget to do that, it won't be super important that you forgot. Often the SteadyShot will, or the gyros in SteadyShot will disable if the camera realizes it doesn't need SteadyShot to be active when you do the long exposure. And 4, so you don't put any vibrations in the camera when pressing the shutter release with a long exposure, use a remote such as Sony's Bluetooth remote, or set the drive mode to self timer 2 seconds. Okay, so this might need to be done on the lens because SteadyShot settings on the camera are grayed out if your camera has a SteadyShot mode button on the lens. Okay, so again, one of the other things that you might want to do is for very long exposures, you might want to come out of 3 into manual exposure mode, manual ISO, and set everything manually. Of course, you're not in a hurry to do this when working with these environments. You've got time on your side, so having a recall memory is not super critical, but there are some instances again why I often find myself coming out of my registered memory. If you are working with these longer exposures on tripods, if you're using focal lengths longer than your wide angle lenses, then just remember your hyperfocal distance isn't going to be 2, 3, 4 meters from the camera. It's likely to be much further away from the camera, and so you've got less opportunities when you're using longer focal lengths. Even this 45mm focal length here, you're not going to get any foreground subject matter that's close to the lens sharp without stopping down to f16 or doing something like focus stacking. I don't really find great use for focus stacking when using ultra wide angle lenses, personally speaking, but I know some photographers do. So here's depth of field calculator at 45 millimeters, and you'll see the hyperfocal distance is much further away from the camera now. It's 15 meters away from the camera. So again, that just shows you how you're not going to have anything in that first 8 meters from the camera lens being rendered in sharp focus. So just something to be wary of. And when working with these even longer focal lengths like this 128 millimeter, this is really where switching SteadyShot is a little bit more important, because the OSS in a lens, the gyros there, if they don't deactivate, you will get vibration happening through your tripod, pass down through the lens. Again, you might get away with it with a Sony telephoto lens, but if you want to be safe, just switch SteadyShot off on the lens. And of course, the hyperfocal distance, for 135mm focal length is possibly going to be 135 meters away, so really very limited opportunity to get anything in sharp focus that's close to the camera. Okay, and of course, when you're working with the APS-C cameras, again, if you can pull long exposures with only stopping down to f8, then that is something that you'll probably want to do. There are going to be instances where you're thinking, well, I don't want to be in 1 for portraits, 2 for action, 3 to be landscapes. I'm just using my interchangeable lens camera as a point and shoot. I'm shooting some things that are just occurring, and I can't even be bothered deciding whether to shoot it in 1, 2 or 3. And in those instances, I would just turn my shoot mode dial away from 1, 2 or 3 to aperture priority, and just adopt the F8 and B there rule of photography. And so that's for when you really don't want to decide. You want to freeze slow moving things. You want depth of field to be sufficient, so you don't have to worry about where you're focusing. You just raise the camera and press the shutter release, and that is the nature of F8 and B there. The timing is more important than any particular camera settings. And so basically what I would try and do is always park the camera in your camera bag with these type of settings. So have the camera set to aperture priority, which would be my first piece of advice. Number 2, set the aperture ring to A on the lens. Set your starting aperture by rolling the rear dial to f8, so that as soon as you take the camera out of the bag and you turn it on, that's the aperture you're going to be shooting with. Some of the other things I would be using by default is have the focus mode set to continuous autofocus. This means that if your subject is slowly moving, your focus mode has got it covered. Set your ISO auto minimum shutter speed to 1/250th, which is usually sufficient to freeze somebody who's walking in the street, or somebody who's not being still in a group portrait. You may be waving an arm around or whatever. And also, if you're just grabbing a shot and you weren't careful enough to keep the camera still, then your 1/250th of a second will avoid having camera shake. Finally, the focus area, just set it to zone and try and get the subject anywhere near the center of the frame when you press the shutter release, and your zone focus area will probably have you covered. Just the thing, if you really like looking at these 3 memories, one of the important new design features of Sony's very latest A7 IV camera is this sub dial below the shoot mode dial. This means that you can turn that dial to movies or S and Q, and you could register 3 additional movies, 3 additional memories for movies, 3 additional memories for S and Q. So instead of having 3 registered memory, it is possible on the A7 IV camera to have 9 registered memories. Basically meaning for hybrid shooters, you're less likely to have to deep dive into those menus, because the memories have you covered for movies as well as stills. There are just 3 additional memories that you can also access. So just 3 more is the title of this particular section, and these are the recall custom hold memories, which are different to the ones you access on the 3 memories on the shoot mode dial. So you basically need to choose 3 custom keys, because you can only access these groups of up to 11 camera settings by holding down a custom key. As soon as you let go of the custom key, those memory settings are no longer being recalled. So you have to hold down the custom key while depressing the shutter release. So let's take a look at how we can use these recall custom hold settings, or how I use them would be fairer to say. Now, on very recent additions to the Patreon website, I've actually started adopting a sort of a PAL workflow approach to the 3 recall custom holds that I choose to use. Now, if you're looking at some of the older ebooks now, you might find that I'm using slightly different settings on the recall custom hold, but I'll slowly move to using the newer PAL approach to these. So let's go and look at these settings, which I've recently changed for, say, the Alpha 1 camera and Alpha 7 IV camera, where I now refer to my recall custom hold 1 as a portrait group of settings, and I'll usually set that to a focus hold button. Now, most of Sony cameras have one of these focus hold buttons, unless you're working with one of the older Zeiss design lenses, so you might have to choose a different location for recall custom hold if you don't have that focus hold button. Now, I'll be looking to use settings that are appropriate for maybe shooting a portrait. So I don't need to freeze rapid action with 1/2000th of a second. So imagine this scenario where I've been shooting a triathlon event with people running through the water using my number 2 on the shoot mode dial. Suddenly this athlete comes to a standstill, so I don't need to be shooting him at 10 frames per second at 1/2000th of a second anymore. So I need to slow the drive mode down and also use a slower shutter speed. So I will just hold down the custom hold button, which has been assigned to recall custom hold 1, down, and take 1 or 2 shots of this athlete who is now static. And if he starts running again, I just let go of that custom hold button, and I will revert back to the settings being recalled on my action settings, which is number 2 on the shoot mode dial. So if I was doing the opposite, if I was shooting pictures of people who are standing in the water getting ready for the event, and then I notice somebody who is moving rapidly, I might choose to press my recall custom hold 2 custom key. Now, I've assigned the AF on button because I'm not a back button AF user, so this is not a super useful custom key if I'm not a back button shooter. So I've reassigned it to recall custom hold 2. So I'm now moving out of my portrait settings into shooting 1/2000th of a second with the drive mode shooting at maximum frames per second. So that is why I might just quickly press the AF on button rather than turning the shoot mode dial just for one sequence of shots. Same thing with maybe a bird photographer who's been shooting birds on the wing with the shoot mode dial set to 2. If the bird takes a perch, then you don't need that 1/2000th of a second anymore, and you certainly don't need to be shooting them at 20 or 30 frames per second. So again, pressing the focus hold button on the lens assigned to recall custom hold 1 will slow the shutter speed down, which will also lower the ISO and allow you to grab 1 or 2 shots at this lower ISO value. And of course this allows me to maybe shoot a bird that's not quickly moving to keep the optimum ISO in these instances, or if I've been shooting a bird that's static using with the shoot mode dial turned to number 1, and then I think it's just about to lunge to catch a fish, I might hold down the AF on button and to access my action settings, and then just depress the shutter release as soon as I see the bird make any rapid movements. Same with a bird in a tree. I've been shooting birds sitting on a branch with the shoot mode dial set to 1. I think it's about to take flight, so I just press the AF on button so I'm ready to shoot a number of shots with the bird in flight. I'll just give you a few more examples so you really get the idea. Like maybe I've been tracking kangaroos in full flight. Suddenly one comes to a standstill because they can see me with the camera. So rather than coming out of shoot mode 2, I just hold down the focus hold button on the lens, and then alternatively, if I've been capturing photographs of kangaroos or wallabies that are all grazing, and then suddenly I notice one of them takes flight, then I can just press the AF on button. It's just a faster way to get the settings just for a one-off occasion. Likewise, if I maybe been shooting a landscape setting and suddenly I see this cyclist coming through the view, I can just press the AF on button and then shoot the cyclist coming back through this urban landscape view here. This was actually a case in point where I was shooting a picture of a pier with my landscape settings. I heard behind me a dog running on the beach. I turned around and then I just blasted it with a recall custom hold group of settings here. Again, I might be shooting somebody selling jewelry off a stall, in this in Monument Valley here, and then suddenly I decide that I need more depth of field, so I quickly this time press the AEL button, which will recall my landscape. So definitely approaching that as the PAL workflow: 1 on the focus hold button, 2 on the AF on button, 3 my landscape on the AEL button. Now the AEL button is the acronym for auto exposure lock, but it's a feature that I don't use. I very much use exposure compensation after framing the shot. I don't lock the exposure and then reframe. So that is a button begging to be reassigned to something more useful for my own particular workflows. And again, same thing, I get surprised by suddenly an unfolding landscape. So I had been shooting something in the park that I'm standing on, and now I just need to access my default landscape settings, and just very quickly as that Chinese junk passes there, just press the AEL button on the camera and that quickly recalls my optimum landscape settings. As said, you will be able to set a lot of cameras up now using my cam set file. They do go hand in hand with the ebook, so in order to understand how many settings I've actually modified, you probably want to look at all of the genres in the ebook, watch my masterclass movies to understand how the camera is set up, why it's set up in this way. Some people decide to override a few of the settings, and that's okay, and that's where you look at that modify memory video tutorial where you can learn how to do that as well. So basically my cam set files are recording all of my memories on the shoot mode dial, and it's also all of the custom keys, the dials, the FN menus, the recall custom holds. So all of that is wrapped up inside of that single cam set file. The original A7R4 does require the 1, 2 and 3 PAL settings to be loaded separately, but I do have a video tutorial specifically for the Alpha 7R4 which shows those 1, 2 and 3 settings being loaded because the cam set doesn't automatically do it by default. Okay, so I will try and cover most of the new cameras with the ebooks as they are released. There is only one camera in the last 4 or 5 years that I haven't created an ebook for, and that's the Alpha 7S3, because that's a very video-centric camera, and all of the other models cover or do enough video or have enough settings for video that I require. So generally, as a still-centric photographer, I'm here to cover primarily all of the stills cameras. Okay, so you will of course get all that support on Patreon. Just remember to not only download the ebook, but check out the Q&A forums, look at the seminars. There's over 20 hours of member-only seminars, including post-production specials and topic-specific seminars, and of course the cam set files as well. So check out those archives. The archives will have a listing of the key topics covered, so don't just look at the titles, look at the what is covered in those particular seminars, and you might find something of interest to your own particular workflows in those seminars. Okay, so thanks for getting through to the end of this extended masterclass PAL workflow video tutorial. There is another one which is freely available on YouTube, which is a memory mastermind video tutorial. I decided to create this longer updated version to be a little bit more specific about how to use this workflow in this updated version. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, just drop them in the forum below this post.